Picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 1945. World War II just ended. Families are finally coming home and America's feeling that post-war optimism. But in a small town in West Virginia, 5 children are about to vanish into thin air during what should have been the most magical night of the year. And here's the kicker, they might still be alive today, somewhere out there, not knowing who they really are. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, the place where we dig into the stories they definitely didn't teach you in school. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. We're talking about the Sodder family fire, a case so bizarre, so full of plot holes you'd think it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter having a really dark day. If you're into the kind of stories that'll keep you up at night wondering what the hell really happened, smash that like button and subscribe, only if you're ready for the real story, not the sanitized version. Hit that notification bell, because we're about to unpack 80 years of conspiracy theories, government cover-ups, and a family that never stopped searching for the truth. Alright folks, grab your favorite warm drink, dim those lights and settle in. This one's a marathon, not a sprint, we're going deep. And I mean basement of the internet, deep into every twisted detail of this case. So let's set the scene. It's December 24th, 1945. You're probably thinking Christmas cookies presents under the tree, maybe some eggnog. But for the Sodder family in Fayetteville, West Virginia, this Christmas Eve is about to become a nightmare. This nightmare would haunt them and baffle investigators for the rest of their lives. Now, before we get into the absolute madness that unfolded that night, you need to understand something crucial about this case. This isn't your typical missing person story. This isn't even your typical family tragedy. This is a case where every single piece of evidence points to something that shouldn't be possible, where every official explanation falls apart under the slightest scrutiny, and where the more you dig, the more convinced you become that someone or some organization wanted these children to disappear. You see, when 5 kids vanish from a burning house and leave behind no trace, no bones, no dental work, nothing at all, you're dealing with something that defies the basic laws of physics. When a fire department takes almost an hour to travel 2.5 miles, when phone lines get cut just before a house fire, when ladders mysteriously disappear and trucks won't start, you're not looking at a series of unfortunate coincidences. You're looking at something much more sinister. The Sodder case has everything a conspiracy theorist could want. Government cover-ups, organized crime connections, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and a family that refused to accept the official story, no matter how much pressure they faced. It's got decades of false leads, mysterious photographs, deathbed confessions, and enough red flags to stock a Soviet parade. But here's what makes this case truly haunting. It's not just about what happened that night, it's about what didn't happen. It's about an investigation that never really investigated authorities, who seemed more interested in covering up than uncovering. It's also about a community that somehow managed to look the other way, while a family's life was destroyed. And the most chilling part, after almost 80 years, we still don't know what really happened to Morris Martha, Louis Jenny, and Betty Sodder. They were children aged 5 to 14, who went to sleep on Christmas Eve and were never seen again. Well, officially never seen again, because there have been sightings, photographs, tips, and leads that suggest maybe some of them survived. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if you were one of those children, taken from your family on Christmas Eve, given a new name, a new life, raised by strangers, never knowing your real identity. Imagine growing up completely unaware that somewhere in West Virginia, your parents spent every waking moment searching for you, putting up billboards, hiring private investigators, following every lead, no matter how desperate it seemed. Or maybe you remember fragments of house fire voices in the night being carried away from everything you knew. Maybe you've spent your whole life with this nagging feeling that something about your childhood doesn't add up. Maybe you feel that the people you call parents aren't quite telling you the whole truth. This is the story of the Sodder family, but it's also the story of how quickly the American dream can turn into the American nightmare. It's about what happens when regular people go up against forces much bigger than themselves. It is also about when the system that's supposed to protect you becomes the very thing you need protection from. So buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in American history. And fair warning, by the end of this story, you're going to have a lot more questions than answers. You're going to wonder how something like this could happen in America, and more importantly, you're going to wonder what other stories like this have been buried and forgotten. Let's start at the beginning with a family that believed in the American dream and ended up living an American nightmare. Now, before we get to the fire that changed everything, you need to understand who the Sodders were. Because this wasn't just any family, this was the embodiment of the American Dream Immigrant Edition. Let me introduce you to George Sodder, a man who'd make your typical American success story look like child's play. George came to America in 1908 from the island of Sardinia off the coast of Italy. He was barely a teenager when he made that journey, carrying nothing but determination and a work ethic that would put modern hustle culture to shame. Picture George. In those early days, a kid who didn't speak English, didn't know anyone, didn't have any connections or advantages. But George had something that turned out to be more valuable than any of that. He refused to be defeated. The guy worked construction jobs, saved every penny, learned English by reading newspapers and arguing with anyone who'd listen to him practice. By 1945, George had built himself a successful trucking business in Fayetteville, West Virginia. And we're not talking about a couple of trucks and a prayer. This was a legitimate operation, the kind of business that provided good jobs in a town that needed them. George was the kind of immigrant success story that politicians love to talk about during election season, except George actually lived it. But here's the thing about George that becomes crucial to our story. The man had opinions, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. George was the kind of guy who'd tell you exactly what he thought, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Classic immigrant mindset: work hard, speak your truth, and don't let anyone push you around. In the 1940s, when fascism was tearing Europe apart, George was vocally, passionately anti-Mussolini. While some Italian Americans were trying to keep their heads down and blend in, George was giving speeches at local gatherings and hosting meetings at his house. He was making it very clear where he stood on the whole fascism thing. Spoiler alert, he was not a fan. Now let me tell you about Jenny Sodder, George's wife, and the heart of this family. Jenny was also from Italy, and when I say she was a devoted mother, I mean this woman could have given master classes in maternal fierce protectiveness. Jenny was what we'd call a mama bear. You mess with her kids, you mess with her. Keep that in mind because it becomes crucial later. Jenny managed a household of 10 children. 10 in an era before modern conveniences made that kind of domestic juggling act slightly less insane. Think about that for a moment. No dishwashers, no washing machines, no microwaves. Just Jenny, her determination, and an apparently supernatural ability to keep track of 10 different personalities, 10 different sets of needs, 10 different futures she was helping to shape. The Sodder children ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, and each one had their own personality, their own dreams, their own place in the complex ecosystem of a large Italian-American family. There was Marion, the eldest, already married and starting her own family. Then came Sylvia, who was helping to care for the younger one. John was the kind of kid who could fix anything mechanical, the family problem solver. But it's the 5 youngest children that our story really centers on because they're the ones who would disappear. Maurice was 14, old enough to help with the family business, and young enough to still believe in magic. Martha was 12. She was at that perfect age where childhood and adolescence meet in a confusion of dreams and possibilities. Louis was 9, Betty was 5, and little Jenny, named after her mother, was the baby at just 5 years old. Living in rural West Virginia in 1945 was like living in a completely different world from today. The Sodders had their big Italian dinners, their loud conversations, their strong opinions, and their absolute devotion to family. Sunday dinners were epic productions involving multiple generations, enough food to feed a small army, and passionate discussions about everything from politics to the best way to make tomato sauce. But here's where the American dream starts to get complicated. It's 1945, we just finished fighting a world war, and guess which country was on the other side? That's right, Italy. So you've got this successful Italian family in small-town West Virginia right after we just finished fighting Italy in a world war. You can imagine how that played with some of the locals. The post-war period was weird for Italian Americans. On one hand, guys like Joe DiMaggio were American heroes. On the other hand, there was still this undercurrent of suspicion, this idea that maybe Italian Americans weren't quite as American as they claimed to be. It was the kind of prejudice that wasn't always spoken out loud, but was always there, lurking under the surface of polite conversation. And George, with his big mouth and his strong opinions, wasn't exactly flying under the radar. The man was successful, outspoken, and completely uninterested in keeping his head down. In a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business, that combination can make you enemies without you even realizing it. Here's where things start getting weird. And I mean, the universe is trying to tell you something weird. In the months leading up to Christmas 1945, the Sodders started experiencing what you might politely call unusual incidents. These weren't the kind of random bad luck that happens to everyone. These were the kind of targeted problems that make you start looking over your shoulder. There were strange phone calls, not wrong numbers, but calls where someone would ask for people who didn't live there, or calls where the person would hang up as soon as they heard George's voice. The family started getting anonymous threats related to George's political activities. Someone didn't like George's anti-fascist stance, and they weren't being subtle about letting him know. George's trucking business started having problems that seemed to go beyond normal mechanical failures. Trucks would break down in ways that suggested sabotage rather than wear and tear. Contracts that had been signed and sealed would suddenly fall through for mysterious reasons. Competitors started winning bids with prices that seemed impossibly low, as if they had inside information about George's bids. The local business community in Fayetteville was tight-knit, and George's success had ruffled some feathers. Some of the established families didn't appreciate this Italian immigrant coming in and taking contracts they felt belonged to them. There were whispers about George's political activities, suggestions that maybe someone who spoke out so strongly against Mussolini might have other questionable loyalties. But the really disturbing incidents were more personal. Someone left a dead animal on the Sodders' property. Windows in their house were broken by rocks thrown in the middle of the night. George started receiving written warnings, not threats exactly, but messages that made it clear someone was watching his family and didn't approve of his activities. The final warning came from someone George actually knew, a local insurance salesman who'd been trying to sell George life insurance policies on his children. When George refused, the man made a comment that George would later remember with chilling clarity. He told George that his house was old, that it would burn easily, and that his children would be destroyed. George thought it was just a sales pitch gone wrong, the kind of scare tactic that sleazy salesmen sometimes use. He was wrong. Looking back, all these incidents form a pattern that's impossible to ignore. Someone was escalating a campaign of intimidation against the Sodder family, and it was building towards something. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was simple. Was the Christmas Eve fire the culmination of this campaign, or was it something even more sinister? Because here's what makes the Sodder case so disturbing. These weren't random victims of a random tragedy. These were specific people who had made specific enemies, living in a specific place, at a specific time, when being the wrong kind of immigrant, with the wrong kind of opinions, could get you into the wrong kind of trouble. The American dream had brought George Sodder success, prosperity, and a large, loving family, but the American nightmare was about to show him that sometimes no amount of hard work, no amount of success, no amount of love can protect you from forces that are bigger, more organized, and more ruthless than anything you can imagine. Christmas Eve, 1945, was going to change everything. The Sodders would wake up on Christmas morning missing 5 children, and they would spend the rest of their lives searching for answers that seemed to slip further away with each passing year. The American dream was about to become the American nightmare, and nothing would ever be the same. December 24th, 1945, Christmas Eve. The Sodder house was buzzing with that special kind of pre-Christmas energy that only large families can generate. 10 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, each with their own level of excitement, their own Christmas traditions, their own way of contributing to the beautiful chaos that defines holiday preparation in a household where love is measured not in quiet moments, but in the joyful noise of family life. Jenny had been cooking for days, the kind of elaborate Italian Christmas preparation that turns a kitchen into a small factory of deliciousness. The house smelled like Christmas, like family, like everything good about being alive. George was in high spirits despite the recent troubles with his business. Christmas was always his favorite time of year, the time when his success felt most meaningful, because he could see it reflected in his children's faces. He'd worked hard to give his family the kind of Christmas he could never have imagined as a poor kid in Sardinia. There were presents under the tree, not extravagant, but thoughtful, chosen, with the kind of care that comes from knowing each child as an individual. The older children were helping with preparations, but the 5 youngest, Morris, Martha, Louis, Betty, and little Jenny, were just soaking up the magic. The evening started normally. The family had their traditional Christmas Eve dinner, a feast that would have impressed a restaurant critic. After dinner, some of the children stayed up later than usual, because hey, it's Christmas Eve. Around 9 o'clock, the phone rang. Jenny answered, and the voice on the other end was a woman she didn't recognize. The caller asked for someone who didn't live at the Sodder house. When Jenny explained that there was no one by that name, the caller didn't apologize. Instead, the woman seemed confused, like she couldn't understand why this person wasn't there. In the background of the call, Jenny could hear music and voices like there was a party going on. The call bothered Jenny, but Christmas Eve has its own momentum. By 10 o'clock, most of the family was settling down for the night. George and Jenny made sure the younger children were tucked in upstairs. The house gradually quieted from the joyful noise of Christmas Eve to the peaceful silence of Christmas Eve night. George and Jenny finally made it to their bedroom around 10:30. George fell asleep almost immediately. Jenny lay awake for a while, as mothers do mentally, going through the next day's plans, feeling that perfect contentment that comes from knowing your family is safe and happy and all together under one roof. She had no idea that in just a few hours, half of her children would be gone forever. At 12:30 a.m., technically Christmas morning, Jenny woke up to a sound that every parent dreads. It wasn't quite a noise, more like a wrongness in the air. And then she smelled it. Smoke. But not the good kind of smoke. Not fireplace smoke or cooking smoke. This was different, acrid, chemical, the kind of smoke that makes your throat close up and your brain immediately switch into panic mode. Jenny shook George awake, and within seconds they could both hear it, the crackling sound of fire. And not a small fire. This was the sound of something big burning, something that had already gotten out of control while they slept. George jumped out of bed and immediately ran to check on the children. The four oldest, Mary and Sylvia John and George Jr., slept on the first floor, and he was able to wake them and get them outside quickly. But when he tried to get to the second floor where the five youngest children were sleeping, he found the stairs were already engulfed in flame. Picture this moment. You're a father, you can hear your children upstairs, but the stairs are literally on fire. The smoke is so thick you can barely see, the heat is so intense you can't get close. George ran outside to try to reach the second floor from the outside. There was a ladder that he kept against the house for maintenance work. It should have been right there, easily accessible. But when he got to where the ladder should have been, it wasn't there. The ladder was gone. Think about that for a moment. Your house is on fire, your children are trapped on the second floor, and the ladder you need to reach them has mysteriously disappeared. This is where the Sodder case starts to shift from tragic accident to what the actual hell is happening territory. George ran to his trucks. He had two of them parked nearby, and either one could have been driven close to the house so he could climb on top and reach the second floor windows, but neither truck would start. Both trucks, which had been running fine just hours earlier, were completely dead. By now, Jenny was trying to call the fire department, but when she picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. The phone lines had been cut. Let me repeat that. The phone lines had been cut. Meanwhile, the fire was spreading with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The Sodder house was burning like it had been doused in gasoline. The most heartbreaking part of George's testimony about that night was his description of trying to hear his children. Were they crying? Were they calling for help? The sound of the fire was so loud, the chaos so complete, that he couldn't tell if his children were still alive, or if they had already succumbed to the smoke and flames. Jenny was outside with the four children they'd managed to save, trying to keep them calm while watching their house and possibly 5 of their siblings being consumed by flames. The neighbors started arriving, but none of them could do anything more than George had already attempted. The fire was too big, too hot, too fast. And where was the fire department? Fayetteville had a volunteer fire department stationed just 2.5 miles from the Sodder house. Under normal circumstances, they should have been able to reach the house in 5 to 10 minutes maximum. But these weren't normal circumstances. The fire department didn't arrive until almost an hour after the fire started. Let me say that again. The fire department took almost an hour to travel 2.5 miles. When the firefighters finally did arrive, they didn't bring enough water. Their equipment had mysterious malfunctions. By dawn on Christmas morning, the house was completely destroyed. What had been a warm, loving home full of Christmas preparations was now a pile of smoldering debris. So the fire department takes almost an hour to travel 2.5 miles. I've seen people get pizza delivered faster during a blizzard. Let's talk about what should have happened versus what actually happened, because the gap between those two realities is where this story gets really disturbing. Fayetteville, West Virginia, in 1945 wasn't exactly New York City, but it wasn't the middle of nowhere either. The volunteer fire department was staffed by local men who knew every street, every house, every shortcut in town. 2.5 miles should have been a 5-minute drive, maybe 10, if they had to stop to pick up additional volunteers. But here's what actually happened. When someone finally managed to get word to the fire department, and remember the Sodders' phone lines had been cut, so a neighbor had to make the call, the response was what you might generously describe as leisurely. The fire chief later claimed they had trouble locating the fire. Trouble locating a house that was completely engulfed in flames in a town of less than 2,000 people. Right. Then there were equipment problems. The fire truck supposedly had mechanical issues. The water tank wasn't full, every excuse in the book except for the one excuse that might have made sense: we were told not to hurry. When they finally did arrive, their performance was about as impressive as you'd expect from a group of people who seemed more interested in covering their tracks than fighting fires. They showed up with inadequate water supplies for a fire that had been burning for almost an hour. Their equipment had mysterious malfunctions, and their attitude seemed to be less focused on rescue and more focused on damage control. George spent the entire night trying everything humanly possible to reach his children. He attempted to climb the exterior walls of the house. He tried to break down doors that were blocked by fire, but every time George thought he'd found a solution, something went wrong. The ladder was missing. The trucks wouldn't start. The phone lines were cut. It was as if someone had systematically eliminated every possible way for the family to save themselves or get help. Instead of focusing on rescue, firefighters seemed more concerned with preventing the fire from spreading to neighboring properties. They focused on containment rather than rescue, as if they had already given up on the possibility that anyone inside could be saved. For firefighters responding to a house fire where children were trapped, this approach was not just unusual, it was unconscionable. But here's where it gets even weirder. The fire department's official report was filed remarkably quickly for such a complex incident. Usually investigations into fires where people die take weeks or even months. There are protocols to follow, evidence to gather, questions to ask. But the Fayetteville Fire Department seemed to have everything figured out within hours. Their conclusion: faulty wiring. Case closed. 5 children dead. Cause of fire determined. Nothing to see here. Move along. Now, faulty wiring is a legitimate cause of house fires, but faulty wiring doesn't explain missing ladders, dead phone lines, or trucks that mysteriously won't start. Faulty wiring doesn't explain why the fire burned so hot and so fast that it supposedly vaporized 5 children, but left other household items intact. The police response was equally impressive, and by impressive, I mean completely inadequate. The cops took one look at this mess and basically said, "Yep, house fire kids died, case closed." There was no criminal investigation, no examination of the missing ladder or the cut phone lines, no questions about why the trucks wouldn't start or why the fire department took so long to respond, no interviews with neighbors who might have seen something suspicious, no follow-up on the threats George had been receiving. The official story was simple: tragic accident, faulty wiring, 5 children dead, nothing suspicious, end of story. And anyone who questioned that narrative was told they were being unreasonable, that they needed to accept the tragedy and move on with their lives. But George and Jenny weren't buying it, and neither were some of their neighbors. The neighbors who witnessed the fire had their own questions about what they'd seen. Several people reported seeing the fire from a distance and being surprised at how quickly it spread and how completely it consumed the house. House fires, even bad ones, usually leave something recognizable: walls, foundation, large pieces of furniture. But the Sodder house burned with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. Other neighbors reported seeing strangers in the area in the days leading up to the fire. Cars they didn't recognize, people asking questions about the Sodder family, individuals who seemed to be watching the house from a distance. One neighbor specifically remembered seeing someone near the Sodder property on the evening of December 23rd, just hours before the fire. This person was doing something near where the ladder was usually kept. The next morning, when the ladder was discovered to be missing, that neighbor began to wonder if what they'd seen was someone removing or hiding the ladder. Within days of the fire, heavy equipment was brought in to clear the debris. This wasn't a careful archaeological excavation designed to recover evidence or remains. This was a wholesale removal operation that seemed designed to eliminate any trace of what had happened. The debris was loaded onto trucks and hauled away before anyone could conduct a proper search for the children's remains. George protested this rapid cleanup, arguing that a more careful search might reveal what had happened to his children. But he was told that the authorities had already conducted a thorough investigation and that further searching would be pointless and possibly dangerous due to the unstable debris. When George asked to see the official report of this thorough investigation, he was told that the details were part of an ongoing inquiry and couldn't be released. When he asked when the inquiry would be completed, he was given vague answers about bureaucratic procedures and the need for patience. The more George pushed for answers, the more resistance he encountered from official sources. Police officers who had been friendly before the fire became distant and uncooperative. Fire department officials who should have been able to explain their response times and procedures suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever George tried to meet with them. It was as if the entire official apparatus of Fayetteville had decided that the Sodder fire was a closed case. Now here's where we need to talk about basic physics. Human bones don't just vanish even in the hottest fires. We're not talking about crematorium temperatures here. When the authorities finally allowed George to search through the debris of his house, he expected to find the worst possible thing a parent could imagine, finding the remains of his 5 children. What he actually found was somehow even more disturbing. Absolutely nothing. No bones, no teeth, no jewelry, no belt buckles or shoe eyelets or any of the small metal objects that children typically carry. It was as if Maurice, Martha, Louis, Betty, and little Jenny had simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind no physical evidence that they had ever existed. Let me put this in perspective for you. A typical house fire, even a really bad one, burns at temperatures between 1,000 and 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to cause tremendous damage, hot enough to kill, hot enough to destroy most organic materials. But it's not hot enough to completely destroy human bones. To cremate a human body properly, to the point where no identifiable bone fragments remain, requires temperatures of at least 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for several hours in a controlled environment, designed specifically for that purpose. The fire was hot enough to supposedly vaporize 5 children, but couldn't destroy the family piano. That's some selective physics right there. George found the piano. He found pots and pans from the kitchen. He found tools from his workshop. He found pieces of furniture, fragments of dishes, metal components from appliances. The fire had been devastating, but it hadn't been complete. There were plenty of items that had survived in recognizable form, but 5 children had apparently been reduced to nothing at all. George wasn't a scientist, but he wasn't stupid either. He understood that something didn't add up about the complete absence of any remains, so he did what any reasonable person would do. He asked for help from people who knew more about fires than he did. The first expert he consulted was a local funeral director who had experience with bodies that had been damaged by fire. The funeral director was blunt in his professional opinion. A house fire could not have completely destroyed the remains of 5 children without leaving some trace. Bones, teeth, something should have survived. The funeral director suggested that George contact the state fire marshal's office to request a more thorough investigation. When George made that request, he was told that the case had already been investigated and closed. George hired a contractor to help him search through the debris more systematically. They sifted through tons of ash and rubble looking for any trace of his children. They found nothing. Not a bone fragment, not a tooth, not a piece of clothing, not a toy. It was as if the 5 children had never been in the house at all. But here's where things get even more bizarre. George's search of the debris revealed that several important items were missing items that should have survived the fire, even if human remains hadn't. The children had been sleeping in their beds when the fire started. But George found no trace of the bed frames, mattresses, or bedding from the upstairs bedrooms. House fires don't typically vaporize metal bed frames, but somehow the beds where his children had been sleeping had disappeared completely. More disturbing was the absence of any of the children's Christmas presents. George had placed wrapped gifts under the tree on Christmas Eve, including several items for the 5 missing children. Some of those gifts contained metal toys or other objects that should have survived the fire. But like the children themselves, the presents had vanished without a trace. George began to suspect that the rapid cleanup of the debris had been designed to hide evidence rather than to clear the site. When he asked where the debris had been taken, he was told that it had been disposed of in accordance with standard procedures. George basically became a one-man FBI unit, except he actually cared about finding the truth. He hired multiple private investigators over the years, each one bringing a different perspective and different expertise to the case. Some focused on the technical aspects of the fire, how hot it had burned, how long it had lasted. what kind of accelerants might have been used. Others investigated the human elements who might have had motives to harm the family. What kind of resources would be required to orchestrate such an elaborate crime? The private investigators uncovered details that the official investigation had somehow missed. They found evidence that the fire had burned unusually hot in certain areas of the house, suggesting the possible use of accelerants. They discovered that several witnesses had seen unfamiliar cars in the area on the night of the fire. They identified potential suspects who had both motive and opportunity to harm the Sodder family. But every time the private investigators brought their findings to local law enforcement, they were told that the case was closed and that no new investigation was warranted. One private investigator theorized that the children might not have been in the house when the fire started. If they had been removed before the fire began, it would explain both the absence of their remains and the lack of any sound from them during the fire. As George's investigation continued, he began to uncover evidence of what appeared to be a systematic effort to eliminate any trace of what had really happened that night. The rapid cleanup of the debris, the refusal of officials to conduct a thorough investigation, the missing documentation about the fire department's response, the convenient loss of physical evidence. It was as if someone had anticipated that questions would be asked and had taken steps to ensure that those questions couldn't be answered. George also discovered that he wasn't the only person asking questions about the fire. Several neighbors had approached police with information about suspicious activities in the days leading up to the fire, but their reports had been dismissed or ignored. Witnesses who had seen unfamiliar people in the area had been told their observations weren't relevant. One witness had seen someone tampering with the Sodders' phone lines on the afternoon of December 24th. Another had noticed that the ladder was missing from its usual location hours before the fire started. A third had seen unfamiliar vehicles parked near the Sodder property on the evening of December 23rd. All of these reports had been made to police within days of the fire. None of them had been included in the official investigation. When the official story has more holes than Swiss cheese, people start coming up with their own explanations. And honestly, some of them make way more sense. News of the Sodder case began to spread beyond Fayetteville. Newspapers picked up the story, radio programs discussed the case, and magazine articles explored the various theories about what had happened. The case captured public attention because it combined elements that people found fascinating and disturbing: missing children, government incompetence, possible conspiracy, and a family's desperate search for truth. The media attention brought both benefits and problems for the Sodder family. On the positive side, it generated tips and leads from people across the country. On the negative side, it also attracted attention from cranks, conspiracy theorists, and people who wanted to exploit the family's tragedy. George and Jenny received hundreds of letters from people claiming to have seen their children, to know what had happened to them, or to have information that could solve the case. Most of these letters were from well-meaning people who genuinely wanted to help. Some were from people with mental health issues. A few were from people who seemed to have legitimate information, but were afraid to come forward officially. The letters that troubled George and Jenny the most were the ones that seemed to contain inside information about the case details that hadn't been released to the public. These letters typically contained threats, warnings, or taunts, suggesting that whoever had taken the children was still watching the family. So George wasn't just any Italian immigrant. This guy had opinions, and in 1940s, Italy having the wrong opinions could get you into serious trouble. To understand why the Sodder family might have been targeted, you need to understand who George Sodder really was and what he represented to certain people who preferred their immigrants quiet, compliant, and invisible. George had come to America in 1908 from Sardinia, but he hadn't come as a political refugee. He came as a young man looking for opportunity, the classic American immigrant story. But what made George different from many Italian immigrants of his generation was that he never forgot where he came from, and he never stopped caring about what was happening in the country he'd left behind. When Mussolini rose to power in Italy in the 1920s, George watched with growing alarm as fascism took hold of his homeland. While some Italian Americans either supported Mussolini or tried to stay out of European politics entirely, George became vocally, passionately anti-fascist. And when I say vocally, I mean this guy could not shut up about how much he hated fascism. George was basically the guy at the dinner party who brings up politics and doesn't back down. Except the politics involved actual dictators. In the Italian-American community of West Virginia, George's anti-Mussolini stance put him in a complicated position. Some Italian-Americans shared his views and appreciated his willingness to speak out. Others thought he was making trouble for the entire community by drawing unwanted attention to their political opinions. And still others actively supported Mussolini and considered George's activities to be treasonous. George didn't care about the complications. He organized meetings, gave speeches, hosted gatherings at his house, and made it very clear to anyone who would listen that fascism was a cancer that needed to be cut out of Italy before it destroyed the country. He raised money for anti-fascist groups, helped distribute literature critical of Mussolini's regime, and generally made himself a very visible opponent of fascism. This wasn't just academic political discussion for George. He had family and friends still living in Italy who were being affected by Mussolini's policies. He received letters from Sardinia describing the oppression, the economic hardship, the fear that characterized life under fascist rule. For George, opposing fascism wasn't just about politics, it was personal. But George's anti-fascist activities made him enemies both within the Italian-American community and outside it. There were Italian-Americans who genuinely supported Mussolini and saw George's activities as attacks on their heritage and their political beliefs. The first threats George received were related to his business rather than his politics. As his trucking company became more successful, he started winning contracts that had previously gone to established local businesses. George was told in various ways and by various people that he needed to be more cooperative with the local business community. He was encouraged to bid higher on certain contracts so that the traditional winners could continue winning. He was invited to join business associations that seemed more like protection rackets than legitimate trade organizations. When George refused to play along with these arrangements, the pressure escalated. His trucks started having mechanical problems that seemed suspiciously like sabotage. His workers were approached and offered jobs with his competitors, but the really serious threats didn't start until George's political activities began to attract attention from outside the local community. During World War II, the federal government was intensely suspicious of Italian Americans, especially those who were politically active. The FBI maintained files on thousands of Italian Americans, monitoring their activities, reading their mail, and infiltrating their organizations. Italian Americans who were considered potential security risks could be detained, relocated, or have their citizenship revoked. George's anti-fascist activities should have made him an ally of the American government, but instead they seemed to make him a target of suspicion. George began receiving visits from federal agents who wanted to know about his political activities, his contacts in Italy, his sources of funding, and his future plans. These weren't friendly conversations. They were interrogations designed to intimidate and to gather information that could be used against him later. The agents made it clear that George's political activities were being monitored and that his continued residence in the United States was dependent on his good behavior. George, being George, didn't respond well to intimidation. If anything, the federal pressure made him more determined to continue his anti-fascist activities. He saw the government's surveillance as proof that fascist thinking had infected American institutions, and he became even more vocal in his opposition to authoritarianism in any form. This did not improve his relationship with federal authorities. The end of World War II didn't reduce the pressure on George. If anything, it made things worse. George saw the victory over fascism as a beginning rather than an end. He became involved in efforts to help rebuild Italy as a democratic nation, to support war refugees, and to ensure that fascist sympathizers didn't regain power. These activities brought George to the attention of people who had different ideas about what post-war Italy should look like, including organized crime elements. What George didn't fully understand at the time was that his political activities had made him a target of multiple groups with overlapping interests in silencing him. Federal authorities saw him as a potential security risk. Local business interests saw him as an economic threat. Organized crime elements saw him as a potential obstacle to their operations. And Italian-American fascist sympathizers saw him as a traitor to his heritage. Any one of these groups might have had reason to want George silenced, but together they represented a powerful coalition of interests that had both the motive and the resources to orchestrate something as elaborate as the Christmas Eve fire. The federal government had the technical expertise to plan and execute a complex operation. Local business interests had the connections to ensure that official investigations would be limited and inconclusive. Organized crime had the ruthlessness to target children, if that's what it took to send a message. and fascist sympathizers had the ideological motivation to see George's family destroyed. George's investigation into his children's disappearance uncovered evidence that suggested all of these elements might have been involved, but every time George tried to present this evidence to authorities, he was told that his information was either irrelevant or insufficient to warrant further investigation. The official position remained that the fire had been an accident caused by faulty wiring, starting just weeks after the fire reports began coming in from across the region about possible sightings of the missing Sodder children. These were specific detailed sightings from credible witnesses who were convinced they had seen Morris, Martha, Louis, Betty, or Little Jenny. The first major sighting came from a woman in Charleston, West Virginia, about 50 miles from Fayetteville. She called the police to report that she had seen several children in a local diner who matched the descriptions of the missing Sodder children. The children were with adults she didn't recognize, and something about the situation had struck her as wrong. When police investigated, they found that a group matching the woman's description had indeed been at the diner, but they had left before officers arrived. The restaurant staff remembered the group, but said the adults had paid in cash and hadn't provided any identification. The children had seemed quiet and subdued. George and Jenny immediately drove to Charleston to interview the witness and the restaurant staff themselves. The woman's description of the children was remarkably detailed and accurate, including specific details about the children's appearances that hadn't been released to the public. But by the time George and Jenny arrived, the trail was cold. The group had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. This pattern would repeat itself dozens of times over the following years. Credible witnesses would report detailed sightings of children who seemed to be the missing Sodders. George and Jenny would rush to investigate, often arriving to find that the trail had gone cold, but that the witness testimony was convincing enough to fuel their hopes. One particularly compelling series of sightings came from the Carolinas, where multiple witnesses reported seeing a group of children working at a rural orphanage under conditions that seemed more like forced labor than proper care. The children matched the ages and descriptions of the Sodder children, and several witnesses specifically noted that the children seemed to be of Italian descent. George hired private investigators to look into the orphanage reports. The facility was operating with minimal oversight from state authorities. The children there had no clear documentation about their backgrounds or how they had come to be at the orphanage, and the staff was evasive when asked questions about the children's origins. When the private investigators tried to get close enough to the children to make positive identifications, they were told that the facility didn't allow unauthorized contact with the children. The investigators did manage to observe some of the children from a distance, and their reports suggested that several of them could potentially be the missing Sodder children. The most famous lead in the Sodder case came in 1968, more than 20 years after the fire. Someone mailed the family a photograph with no return address and no accompanying letter. The photograph showed a young man who looked exactly like what Louis Sodder would have looked like if he had grown up and survived to adulthood. The photograph was professionally taken and appeared to be recent. The young man in the photo had distinctive features that strongly resembled Louis Sodder, including specific physical characteristics that would be very difficult to fake or coincidental. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single word, Louis. George and Jenny were both excited and terrified by the photograph. If it was really Louis, it meant that at least one of their children had survived and grown up. But it also meant that someone who knew Louis's whereabouts was choosing to torment them with proof of his survival, rather than facilitating a reunion. The family immediately took the photograph to the FBI for analysis. The Bureau's experts examined the photograph for signs of manipulation or forgery, but were unable to determine definitively whether it was authentic. More disturbing was the FBI's analysis of the paper and printing process used to create the photograph. The technical characteristics suggested that the photograph had been taken and processed professionally, possibly using equipment available to intelligence agencies. In 1952, George and Jenny made a decision that would define their search for the rest of their lives. They purchased a billboard on Route 16, the main highway through Fayetteville, and used it to publicize their search for their missing children. The billboard featured photographs of the 5 missing children, along with a reward offer for information leading to their recovery. The billboard became a local landmark visible to thousands of travelers every day. For almost 40 years, it served as a constant reminder that 5 children had vanished, and that their family had never stopped looking. It was a monument to hope, determination, and the refusal to accept that some mysteries can't be solved. The billboard generated hundreds of tips and leads over the years. Most of them were false alarms. Some were from people with mental health issues. A few seemed to contain legitimate information, but couldn't be verified. The most disturbing responses to the billboard were the anonymous letters and phone calls that seemed designed to torment the family rather than to help them. These communications typically contained just enough accurate information to suggest that the sender really did know something about the case, but not enough information to actually help solve it. These communications followed a pattern that suggested they were coming from someone who wanted to keep the family's hopes alive, while ensuring that they would never actually find their children. As the years passed and conventional investigation methods failed to produce results, George and Jenny began exploring more unconventional approaches to finding their children. They consulted psychics, mediums, and other people who claimed to have supernatural insights into the case. Most of these consultations were disappointing. A few psychics provided information that was more detailed and specific, but this information typically led to dead ends when investigated. The most disturbing psychic consultation came from a woman who claimed that the children were still alive, but were being held by people who would kill them if their location was discovered. She urged the family to stop their public search efforts and warned that continued publicity would put the children in danger. Throughout their search, George and Jenny repeatedly tried to get cooperation from federal authorities. They requested FBI investigation into the case, access to government files, and assistance in following up on leads that crossed state lines. The government's response was consistently unhelpful. FBI agents would meet with the family, listen politely to their requests, and then explain that the case didn't fall under federal jurisdiction. Requests for access to government files were denied on the grounds that such files were classified. The bureaucratic runaround was so consistent and so thorough that it seemed deliberate rather than accidental. What if this wasn't about killing the kids, but about taking them? In 1945, black market adoption was a real thing, and 5 healthy children would be worth a fortune. Let's start with the most straightforward alternative theory: organized kidnapping. The kidnapping theory explains several aspects of the case that the official story can't address. It explains why the children's bodies were never found because they weren't in the house when it burned. It explains the systematic elimination of escape routes, the missing ladder, the dead trucks, the cut phone lines, because these were designed to prevent the family from interfering with the kidnapping operation. It also explains the fire itself. Setting the house on fire after removing the children would serve multiple purposes. It would destroy evidence of the kidnapping. It would provide a plausible explanation for the children's disappearance, and it would discourage the family from searching for children they believed to be dead. Private investigators hired by the Sodder family found evidence that supported the kidnapping theory. They discovered that there had been a market for illegally obtained children in the region, and that several organized groups had been involved in this trade. They also found evidence that some of these groups had connections to both organized crime and corrupt government officials. The second major theory about the Sodder case involves organized crime. George Sodder's success as a businessman had put him in conflict with established local interests, some of whom had connections to organized crime. His refusal to pay protection money or to cooperate with illegal business arrangements had made him enemies in the criminal underworld. The mafia connection theory suggests that the fire was a retaliation attack designed to punish George for his non-cooperation and to send a message to other businessmen who might be considering similar defiance. Taking his children rather than killing them would be a particularly cruel form of revenge George would suffer for the rest of his life, knowing that his children were alive somewhere, but unable to find them. This theory is supported by the threats George had received prior to the fire, many of which had specifically mentioned his family and his children. The involvement of organized crime would also explain the official response to the case. In 1945, corruption of local officials by organized crime was common. If the local police and fire department had been compromised, it would explain why the investigation was so inadequate and why the cleanup was so rapid. But the organized crime theory also has limitations. Kidnapping 5 children would have created enormous risks for relatively little benefit. But what if the government was involved? The government cover-up theory is the most disturbing of the major alternatives, and unfortunately it's also one of the most plausible when you consider the historical context. In 1945, the federal government was intensely paranoid about the loyalty of Italian Americans. The FBI maintained extensive surveillance operations targeting Italian American communities. George Sodder's vocal opposition to fascism should have made him an ally of the American government, but instead it seems to have marked him as a potentially dangerous political activist. The government cover-up theory suggests that federal agents decided George was too dangerous to be allowed to continue his political activities, but that directly arresting or deporting him would have created political problems. Taking his children and allowing him to believe they were dead would effectively neutralize him as a political activist. This theory is supported by several pieces of evidence. Government documents released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests show that George was indeed under FBI surveillance in the months before the fire. The technical sophistication of the operation, the systematic elimination of escape routes, the rapid response cleanup, the coordination required to prevent effective investigation suggests resources and expertise that would have been available to government agencies. One of the most unusual theories about the Sodder case is the witness protection theory. This suggests that the children weren't kidnapped by criminals or taken by government agents for nefarious purposes, but were instead rescued by government agents who believed they were in imminent danger. According to this theory, federal agents had learned of a plot against the Sodder family and decided that the only way to protect the children was to remove them from their home and give them new identities. The fire was set to provide cover for the rescue operation and to convince the plotters that their plan had succeeded. This theory would explain why the children were never found and why government agencies seemed determined to discourage investigation. If the children were living under new identities in a government protection program, any investigation that came too close to finding them would put them in danger from the same people they had originally been rescued from. The witness protection theory is supported by some evidence, including reports of sightings that suggested the children were alive and well, and the mysterious photograph that seemed to show Louis Sodder as an adult. It would also explain why some government communications about the case seemed to contain inside information about the children's survival. The insurance fraud theory is the most disturbing alternative explanation, and the one that the family's supporters are most reluctant to consider. This theory suggests that George and Jenny were involved in their own children's disappearance, possibly as part of an insurance fraud scheme, or to escape financial difficulties. According to this theory, the Sodders arranged for their children to be taken and hidden, then set their house on fire to collect insurance money, while creating a cover story for the children's absence. The elaborate nature of the operation, the missing ladder, the dead trucks, the cut phone lines, was designed to make the kidnapping look like the work of outside criminals. This theory is supported by some troubling evidence. George had been experiencing financial difficulties with his business in the months before the fire. The family had recently increased their insurance coverage, and some aspects of George and Jenny's behavior after the fire seemed inconsistent with parents who genuinely believed their children were dead. But this theory requires believing that parents would deliberately traumatize their surviving children and spend the rest of their lives maintaining an elaborate deception. It also requires believing that 5 children could be hidden for decades without any of them ever trying to contact their original family. For most people, the loss of 5 children would be the end of the story. For Jenny Sodder, it was the beginning of a lifelong obsession that would define every day of the rest of her existence. She transformed from a mother of 10 children into a private investigator, a detective, a woman possessed by the absolute certainty that her children were alive somewhere, and that she would find them. Jenny's daily routine after the fire was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Every morning she would check the mail for letters that might contain information about her children. Every afternoon she would make phone calls to law enforcement agencies, private investigators, and anyone else who might have leads. Every evening she would update her files with new information, plan her next steps, and prepare for another day of searching. She kept detailed records of every tip, every sighting, every possible lead. Her dining room table became a command center, covered with photographs, maps, newspaper clippings, and correspondence with investigators across the country. But Jenny's search wasn't just about gathering information, it was about never letting the world forget that her children were missing. She wrote letters to newspapers, magazine editors, television producers, and radio hosts, trying to keep the story alive in the public consciousness. George's response to his children's disappearance was different from Jenny's, but equally consuming. Where Jenny focused on gathering information and maintaining publicity, George threw himself into active investigation with the determination of a man who believed that hard work and persistence could solve any problem. George hired private investigators not just to look for his children, but to teach him how to conduct investigations himself. He learned how to interview witnesses, how to analyze physical evidence, how to track down leads across multiple states. He transformed his trucking business into a mobile investigation unit, using his roots and his business contacts to gather information wherever he traveled. The financial cost of George's investigation was staggering. He spent thousands of dollars on private investigators at a time when a middle-class family's annual income was measured in hundreds of dollars. He mortgaged his property, sold his possessions, and reinvested every penny of profit from his business into the search for his children, but the personal cost was even higher. George's health deteriorated rapidly under the stress of the investigation and the emotional burden of his loss. He developed heart problems, stomach ulcers, and chronic insomnia. George died in 1969, 24 years after the fire, never knowing what had happened to his children. The impact of the Sodder case on the surviving children was profound and lasting. Mary and Sylvia John and George Jr. grew up in a household dominated by grief obsession and the constant presence of absent siblings. Their parents' search for the missing children shaped every aspect of their childhood and continued to influence their adult lives. The surviving children had conflicting feelings about their parents' search efforts. On one hand, they understood and shared their parents' determination to find their missing siblings. On the other hand, they sometimes felt that their own needs were being neglected in favor of children who might not even be alive anymore. As adults, the surviving children had to decide whether to continue their parents' search or to try to build lives that weren't defined by the tragedy. Some became actively involved in the investigation, contributing their own time and resources to finding answers. Others tried to distance themselves from the case, feeling that the search had already consumed too much of their family's life and energy. Perhaps most difficult was the uncertainty that defined their relationship with their missing siblings. Were Morris, Martha, Louis, Betty, and little Jenny dead, or were they living somewhere under different names? How do you grieve for siblings who might still be alive? The search for the Sodder children didn't end with George and Jenny's deaths. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren have continued the investigation using modern tools and techniques that weren't available to earlier generations. DNA testing, social media searches, genealogy databases, and advanced record-keeping systems have opened new possibilities for solving the case. The modern generation of Sodder family members approaches the search with a different perspective than their grandparents had. They're more skeptical of some of the theories that George and Jenny pursued, more realistic about the likelihood of finding elderly survivors, and more focused on finding answers rather than finding living relatives. But they're also more hopeful about the possibility of solving the case definitively. Modern forensic techniques might be able to analyze evidence that was overlooked or misunderstood in 1945. DNA testing could potentially identify remains or confirm the identity of people who claim to be the missing children. The modern search has also benefited from the internet's ability to connect people with similar interests and experiences. Online communities of amateur investigators have taken an interest in the Sodder case, contributing research skills and resources that supplement the family's efforts. Social media has created new opportunities to publicize the case and generate leads. Over the decades, the Sodder case became a staple of American true crime media. The family appeared on television shows, radio programs, magazine articles, and documentary films. The media attention had both positive and negative effects on the family. On the positive side, it kept the case in the public consciousness and generated tips that might not have emerged otherwise. On the negative side, media attention sometimes sensationalized the case or presented inaccurate information that confused the facts. The Sodder case became a template for other families dealing with missing persons cases. The Sodders' use of publicity, private investigators, and persistent pressure on authorities became a model that other families would follow when official investigations proved inadequate. The case also became a symbol of the limitations of official justice systems. Their story became a cautionary tale about the need for families to advocate for themselves when dealing with unresponsive bureaucracies. But perhaps most importantly, the Sodder case became a story about the power of never giving up. The family that never gave up didn't find their children, but they found something else, the knowledge that they had done everything humanly possible to bring them home. In a world where most mysteries remain unsolved and most injustices go uncorrected, that kind of determination is both rare and precious. In the 21st century, the tools available to investigate cold cases like the Sodder disappearances have advanced far beyond anything George and Jenny could have imagined. The most powerful of these new tools is DNA analysis. Modern DNA testing can identify individuals from microscopic biological samples, establish family relationships with extraordinary precision, and even provide information about ancestry and geographic origins. If any biological samples from the missing children had been preserved, modern testing could create genetic profiles that could be compared against databases containing millions of profiles from around the world. If any of the Sodder children survived and had descendants, DNA testing could potentially identify those descendants and trace them back to their origins. The challenge is that DNA testing requires something to test. In 1945, the concept of preserving biological evidence for future analysis didn't exist. The rapid cleanup of the Sodder house debris eliminated most potential sources of DNA evidence, but there are still possibilities. Items of the children's clothing that were being washed when the fire occurred might contain traces of their DNA. Dental records, if they still exist, might contain enough biological material for testing. Hair or other biological samples that were kept as mementos by family members could provide the genetic material needed for analysis. The democratization of information through the internet has created an army of amateur investigators who bring fresh perspectives and unlimited time to cold cases like the Sodder disappearances. Online communities dedicated to true crime have developed sophisticated research techniques and have access to resources that were previously available only to law enforcement professionals. The Sodder case has been the subject of extensive online investigation. Amateur researchers have digitized newspaper articles from the 1940s, tracked down descendants of witnesses, analyzed historical records, and developed detailed timelines of events. One particularly productive area of online investigation has been the analysis of historical records that weren't easily accessible when George and Jenny were conducting their search. Census records, immigration documents, military service records, and other government documents are now available online and can be searched electronically. These records have revealed new information about some of the potential suspects in the case and have provided context that wasn't available to earlier investigators. Social media has also created new opportunities to publicize the case and generate leads. Facebook groups dedicated to the Sodder case have attracted thousands of members who share information and coordinate research efforts. Twitter hashtags have spread awareness of the case to new audiences. The Freedom of Information Act has opened new windows into government knowledge about the Sodder case. Documents that were classified or restricted for decades are now available to researchers, revealing information about federal surveillance of George Sodder and official knowledge about the case that was never shared with the family. FBI files released through FOA requests show that George Sodder was indeed under federal surveillance in the months before the fire. The Bureau had compiled extensive information about his political activities, his business relationships, and his family situation. The released documents also reveal that federal agencies had more knowledge about the fire and its aftermath than they admitted to the family. Internal communications show that FBI agents were aware of alternative theories about what had happened to the children, and that some agents had doubts about the official explanation of accidental death. Perhaps most disturbing are documents that suggest federal agencies actively discouraged local law enforcement from conducting thorough investigations into the case. Internal memos indicate that federal agents advised local police that the case was not a federal matter and should be closed quickly to avoid unnecessary complications. These revelations don't prove federal involvement in the children's disappearance, but they do demonstrate that federal agencies had more information about the case than they shared with the family or the public. Modern law enforcement agencies have developed specialized cold case units that use advanced techniques and technologies to investigate unsolved crimes from previous decades. These units have sophisticated resources for analyzing old evidence, tracking down witnesses, and developing new leads in cases that were considered unsolvable. Several cold case units have expressed interest in the Sodder case over the years, but most have concluded that the lack of physical evidence and the passage of time make it unlikely that the case can be solved using traditional law enforcement techniques. However, some units have suggested that new approaches might be worth exploring. One promising approach is the systematic re-examination of all physical evidence that still exists from the original investigation. Modern forensic techniques might be able to extract information from evidence that was considered unimportant in 1945. Another approach is the use of modern databases to cross-reference information about the Sodder case with other unsolved cases from the same period. Pattern analysis might reveal connections between the Sodder disappearances and other mysterious incidents involving Italian-American families or political activists. However, cold case units also face limitations when dealing with cases as old as the Sodder disappearances. Most physical evidence has been lost or degraded beyond useful analysis. Most witnesses are dead or too elderly to provide reliable testimony. One of the most promising developments in modern investigation of the Sodder case is the phenomenon of deathbed confessions and late-life revelations from people who had knowledge about the events of 1945 but remained silent for decades. As the generation that was alive during the Sodder fire reaches the end of their lives, some individuals have begun sharing information they kept secret for most of their adult lives. These revelations range from minor details about suspicious activities they witnessed to major claims about direct knowledge of what happened to the children. The motivations for these late confessions vary. Some people say they were afraid to speak out when they were younger because they feared retaliation from the people responsible for the disappearances. Others say they didn't realize the significance of what they knew until they learned more about the case through modern media coverage. Some of the most significant recent revelations have come from the children and grandchildren of people who were involved in various aspects of the case. These second and third generation witnesses have shared family stories, overheard conversations, and documented evidence that their relatives kept hidden for decades. However, evaluating these late revelations presents significant challenges. Memory degrades over time, family stories can become distorted through repeated telling, and some people might be motivated by attention seeking, rather than genuine desire to help solve the case. So here we are almost 80 years later, and we still don't know what the hell happened to the Sodder children. We've explored the bizarre physical evidence that defies basic physics, 5 children supposedly vaporized by a fire that couldn't destroy a piano. We've examined the systematic elimination of every possible escape route, missing ladders, dead trucks, cut phone lines that suggest careful planning rather than tragic coincidence. We've uncovered a web of threat, surveillance, and intimidation that targeted George Sodder for his political beliefs and business success. And most importantly, we've witnessed the extraordinary determination of parents who refuse to accept defeat. Their story reveals some uncomfortable truths about American society in the 1940s. It shows us what could happen to immigrants who were too successful, too outspoken, or too unwilling to blend into the background. It demonstrates how local corruption, federal surveillance, and organized crime could work together to destroy a family and cover up the evidence. But the Sodder case also shows us something inspiring about the human spirit. George and Jenny's refusal to give up their willingness to sacrifice everything in the search for their children, and their determination to challenge authorities who tried to silence them, represent the best of what it means to fight for justice. This case shows us how quickly the American dream can turn into the American nightmare. It also shows us that sometimes the system fails spectacularly, but mostly it shows us the power of never giving up. The Sodders searched for their children until the day they died, and their grandchildren are still searching today. In an age of instant gratification and short attention spans, that kind of dedication is pretty damn inspiring. It also makes you appreciate living in the digital age, doesn't it? Today, if 5 kids went missing, we'd have Amber Alerts, social media campaigns, DNA databases, and 24/7 news coverage. The Sodders had none of that. If the Sodder case happened today, it would be solved within weeks, if not days. The systematic elimination of escape routes would be captured on multiple security cameras. The kidnappers' vehicles would be tracked by license plate readers and traffic cameras. The children's DNA would be in databases that could identify them anywhere in the world. Social media would generate thousands of tips within hours. But that raises its own disturbing questions. If such sophisticated surveillance and tracking technology existed in 1945, would it have been used to protect the Sodder children, or would it have made it easier for their enemies to monitor and target them? What do you guys think really happened? Are the Sodder children still out there somewhere living under different names, maybe not even knowing who they really are? Was this a kidnapping gone wrong? A mafia hit a government operation or something even more sinister? Drop your theories in the comments, and trust me, I read them all. Maybe Morris, Martha, Lewis, Betty, and little Jenny are sitting in nursing homes somewhere with no memory of Christmas Eve. 1945, wondering why they sometimes dream about a house fire, and parents they can't quite remember. Maybe their children and grandchildren carry Sodder DNA without knowing it, and someday, a genealogy test will connect them to their real family history. Or maybe the truth is darker than we want to imagine, and the 5 children never left that burning house after all. Maybe the absence of their remains is evidence of something so disturbing that the authorities decided it was better to pretend they had simply died in a fire than to reveal what really happened to them. Thanks for hanging out with me for this deep dive into one of America's most haunting mysteries. If this kind of story is your thing, you might want to check out some of the other unsolved cases we've covered. Until next time, keep questioning everything, keep searching for the truth. And remember, sometimes the most important stories are the ones that never get properly told. The Sodder children may never come home, but their story will live on as long as people refuse to accept that some injustices can't be corrected and some mysteries can't be solved. Peace out and sweet dreams if you can manage them after this story. Just remember to check your smoke detectors, keep your ladders secure, and maybe think twice about making enemies of people who prefer their problems to disappear quietly. The Sodder children are still out there somewhere waiting to be found. The question is, will we be the generation that finally brings them home?